Hello, and welcome to or welcome back to How to Change the World. I am Catherine Alonso, and I am so thrilled that you have joined us here today because this conversation with Luis Ávila, a longtime community activist and organizer and a really good friend of mine, is so good, and I'm so excited to share it with you. In introducing Luis, I want to tell you a story about my opportunity to work with him recently. Luis leads a company called Iconico, who works with organizers and leaders to make change in their local communities. And he works across the country and around the world to work in different communities to help social change makers bring their vision to life. And we had the opportunity last year to collaborate on a project here in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was our first time working together. And I just got to see how talented and Luis is in an up close personal way, and it was just really fantastic, and I learned so much from him. And this project was challenging. It had its ups and downs, and there were a couple of things that I really learned from watching Luis. One is his flexibility, that he goes into his work with a sense of where he wants to end up, but is not attached at all to what the steps look like along the way. And so there were a couple of times where, for various reasons, we had to pivot, sometimes in the middle of doing the work. And he was so incredible at saying, okay, this isn't working, we're going to try something else. And he explains to everybody involved what's happening and why he's making the choices he's making to bring them along. And then the other thing I observed with Luis is that in leading and facilitating a process and a conversation with community partners, that he is able to take himself out of it completely. And there was one of the sessions that we had with the community partners, and I think I said to him, like, oh, I'm sorry if I cut you off or if I went too long in my section. And he touched me on the shoulder and he said, Catherine, when I'm facilitating, I leave my ego at the door. And it was such an incredible lesson for me in how you facilitate community conversation, where you really remember that it is not about you, that you are there as a conduit, as a facilitator, as somebody to enable the work to be done. But the work is not for me and it is not about me. And those two things, the humility and the flexibility that Luis brings to his work, is completely ever present in our conversation today. We talk about how he creates social change with the people that he partners with. We talk about the importance of having a vision and how he really brings his passion and his driving why to the work that he does. So without any further ado, because I am so excited to share this with you, my conversation with Luis Ávila. So excited to be having this conversation. We have tried to schedule it a couple of times. And so I just feel like timing is everything. And today is meant to be the day. And I am just really excited to have you here and for the conversation we're about to have.
I'm really excited to gather in, and thank you for doing this. Actually, before we started, we had a great conversation already, so I can't wait to continue it.
We did. We already but jumped into our productivity addictions. So we'll see if we get back to that. So Luis, tell me a little bit about the work that you do and how you got to doing the work that you do today.
It's a good question. So I think it has a little bit to do with this conversation about productivity you and I were having. I think as I've gotten older, I've been more comfortable now to say that I'm a social entrepreneur. That's what I do. When I at 15 years old, back in the day when social media didn't exist, I felt the need to create a space where young people could express themselves and where we could say the things that we thought of, right? And it sometimes felt like every spaces for young people back then were kind of like made and decided by adults, right? So I had this fascination with like, why is it that there's no places for us to say what we think, right? What we think about the world, what we think about cultural arts or politics or whatever we wanted to say. So at 15, I started a magazine back in Mexico, where I'm from. And the magazine became really popular amongst young people. And, that kind of became a thing that I thought was going to become my career, journalism. And throughout, those years, I started similar projects, radio stations, radio shows, magazines. And this was with the intention of giving or creating spaces for voice and sharing our voices and our stories. And I think that took me to learn more about when I moved to the United States to immigrant rights. I arrived here in Phoenix, where it's was called the epicenter of hate back then. All this anti-immigrant stuff was happening, and these platforms that I have created were in service now of these communities. And I started getting closer and closer to the work of advocacy, and thought really about how stories could change systems, how working with others and creating spaces with others could help people bring together ideas and create those ideas into action. So in the last 10 years, I've dedicated myself to this company called Iconico, where I basically incubate ideas from communities, from here in Arizona, Instituto, an organization to build capacity of low-income communities and communities of color so they can do work that they want to change their rights or advance their rights or defend their rights, to programs in Indianapolis, for example, for Black parents to run for school board, right? And helping them kind of come together, create coalitions, think about how do they do it together collectively to change systems. So that's what I do. I partner with people around the country and help them create their ideas, facilitate spaces, and help them do that through Iconico and the organizations we created along the way.
Thank you for sharing that with me. It's such an incredible story. And it's so funny that you and I, before we started, were talking about how similar you and I are. And I also wanted to be a journalist, which that goal came crashing down in quite some glory. And I'll tell you that story another time. But that you said, stories can change systems. And I feel like that is where I've ended up too. And really helping organizations tell their story so that they can change systems, which there's this incredible parallel between what we both do. So tell me more about that. How is it that you work with your clients to bring out their story so that they can create the change that they imagine?
Yeah, Catherine, I think that one of the biggest things that I've learned in this last decade is that so many of the stories we tell ourselves are some of the biggest challenges. And what I mean by that is, I was just yesterday in Austin, Texas, with a group of mostly Black and brown leaders from different parts of the country who were creating campaigns to advance education equity. And when I told them, what's getting on the way of you realizing this, a lot of their fears came to things that they believed of themselves, the stories they told of themselves. I'm too young. I'm too inexperienced. I don't have that education. I'm not this, I'm not that. And that kind of work from a place of difference sometimes create deficits in people. So the first thing that I do is I work with people through coaching or facilitation to think about what are the things that are getting on your way that are not institutional or systemic, right? It's the stuff that you internalized, right? Mm-hmm. And some of those stories that we tell ourselves, I think, are some of the biggest challenges that we face, right? Some of those stories sometimes are of scarcity, right? And we become competitors to others, and we start kind of throwing elbows, and we fight small wars in a society that actually needs us to change big things, right? So a lot of the work that I do, Catherine, is in coaching and facilitation to help people kind of get through those big challenges. But then I really do think about the institutional. What are the stories that you tell your team, the people you work with, the communities you work with, to then mobilize, right? How are you creating those visions of the future that are not just always based on defending our rights, right? Like, for example, I think that there's communities that I work with tend to be in a place sometimes of victimization, right? Like, this is happening to us, and this is the ways that we defend ourselves, and really having to move us to places where we can imagine futures that don't exist, right? I call people science fiction writers, right? Like, what is imagine the future you want, and then thinking, how do we bend the present to make that future a reality? And that's through an institution, right? That's through an organization. And then sometimes we think about systemic change, like I had a really amazing opportunity to work with some farmers, female farmers in Nigeria, who after it started getting hotter and water started running out in their communities, their husbands left, and their husbands became part of this horrible guerrilla movement that was growing in the area. And the women started taking care of the land and found ways to, plant more drought-resistant crops. But their law didn't allow them to open bank accounts. So they were super challenged by the risk of having cash, right, and in their hands or in different places. So what we did is we created a campaign to change the law so that women could open bank accounts. Something that sounds so simple for us here in the United States, but in other parts of the world, in the world, are realities. So within a year, this law passed, and these incredible women now have resources in their community, have invested to build wells. One of them is a fashion designer now with the cotton that she actually plants. So it's like really society changes when people are imagining a future that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that is absolutely incredible. Well, and it moves me really perfectly into my next question, which is about your definition of success. So at Javelina, we know that successful change makers tell stories that are really driven around three things: their why, why does the work matter for them? Who are they trying to reach? And then how is success defined? What is it that they are looking to create? And I love that you said that you work with your clients and you tell them to become science fiction writers. Like, let's write a future. Let's write a future that doesn't exist yet. And so I have a couple of questions about that. One of them is that can be quite difficult for people to do. If you're not naturally sort of inclined, it can be very difficult to imagine a better future that doesn't exist yet. And so how do you help your clients and the people that you work with become science fiction writers and imagine, put pen to paper and imagine that future?
That's such an important question, Catherine. I'll tell you that I think the biggest thing is to first remind people that in our lineage and in our backgrounds, we have people who have done it before. Just this week, I was working with this group of leaders. I was talking in Austin, and what I told them was, when Harriet Tubman was thinking about the Underground Railroad, she was imagining something that didn't exist. But not only that, she was imagining a world that nobody else was imagining. We just thought that, slavery was the truth and that's what that it was, right? And she was like, no, there's another reality that I can fight for. And I remind them that in their histories, in their backgrounds, there are people who really exemplify that and say, give yourself permission to unshackle your imagination. Give yourself permission to play. But that permission is only a verbal permission, because so often in our sector, we live in our minds. It's about what we think, right? Everything, how we reason. So I use a lot of somatics, Catherine. I use a lot of getting into people's bodies, right? In this case, doing deep breathing exercises, moving around, visualization stuff, right? Like I asked them to think about different parts of their body where they think them, and then help them little by little, kind of like childlike, start imagining a future. And it's sometimes so scary for them that I've heard stories like, the future I imagine is one where I am dead, or the future that I imagine is one where everything is on fire. But the truth is that more often than not, the imaginations of people are actually pretty positive, right? This woman, Dr. Kokitia, a year ago on an exercise like that, imagine a community center. And just a few months ago, she gave me a call and she said, in that writing I did, in that exercise we did, I imagined the thing that I just launched this month, right? And I gave permission to do it, but also like a child, I imagined that there were limitations. And then I went about it like that, right? And instead of what I used to do, which is always thinking from rationale, what's possible? Do I have the capacity? Are the grants out there? Do I have the experience? All of those things limit our ability to imagine. And I think that's my job, is to help them get to a place where they're more playful, right? And I can hold them accountable to be.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I really, really love that. Are you seeking to create change at the polls? Us too. With Javelina's long history of running winning campaigns, we've learned a thing or two about mobilizing communities. And we know that success isn't about reaching every voter, it's about reaching the right voters. Head over to javelina.co today to sign up for a free consultation and learn how our tailored direct mail services bring voters into your story and drive your campaign to victory. What what is your definition of success when you think about the community or the communities that you are creating through your work? What does it look like, and how is it different from today?
It changes often, Catherine. I've been reflecting on this year. I share with you often, I shared with you earlier that, I made some changes in my business because I'm changing the definition of success. I think for very long, success for me was scale or the reach that we were making. And I realized that that was impacting my quality, the quality of time that I was spending. So the way that I'm defining success right now is the quality of the relationship that I'm able to build so that people can truly make meaningful change. So instead of at the end of the year measuring success by how many people we work with, I'm going to be measuring success by what is the impact that people I work with made, right? That's one way, but it's really rooted, Catherine, to a question that I think I've asked myself from a very young age, and that is, how am I helpful? How can I be helpful to the moment? And a good example of that is that when I moved here from Mexico as an immigrant to the United States, I was really involved in the immigrant rights movement as an activist, right? I was speaking in front of groups. I was like advocating, at the legislature. I was protesting. And there was a moment where I realized that, the fact that I had documents then, and there was this new generation of people without documentation that were coming up, and they were taking on leadership, made me realize that my definition of success had to change. My definition of success now was to help and support these new folks who were coming in. So I became a coach and a facilitator, and that was my success then, right? So it really has to be asking ourselves and being honest. And also through this, Catherine, is that we sometimes get stuck in these identities that we create for ourselves, and we become inflexible. So I do think that I am often asking myself, am I being useful? Am I being helpful? By while also creating boundaries for my well-being, right? But am I helpful? Am I adding value? And if the answer is yes, and be really investigating how I'm doing that, and I think that success for me is the fact that I can continue to evolve and change, because at the end of the day, I'm going to be myself, right? Like my skills and my experience can go to different places where they can be helpful. And that's, I think, the beauty of the moment we're living.
What I absolutely love about that is how you're saying it can change. That yes, you need to have a definition of success, but this is something that you need to check in with, because if your definition of success internally changes and the language that you're using to communicate with yourself doesn't, you're going to feel this tension or this pull between those two things. The other thing I love about your personal definition of success is that it's housed in a question that you can ask yourself, and you do ask yourself on a regular basis, how am I helpful? How am I being helpful? And that is such an incredible and powerful shortcut to be able to get to the core of what matters the most to you in any given moment. And I love that you shared that. I think that's so powerful.
Oh, that's appreciated. Thank you so much for asking the question too.
Well, another question then is, and maybe it's the same thing, but I'm curious to see if it's distinct, is why does the work that you do matter to you? What at the core, why are you driven to do this particular work?
I think you're going to notice a trend here, Catherine, but I'm a storyteller, right? So that when questions are asked, I answer with a story, right? And I think the story of Diana, who I just saw this week, actually it's a really clear example of why the work I do matters. 7 years ago, this woman reached out to me. She's a Black woman from Washington, D.C., works in an organization over there. And from time to time, Catherine, this happens to you too, I think, often, where people say, hey, you should talk to Catherine because, she has this experience or this expertise. And someone connected us. I don't even remember who. And for us to talk about her role as a community organizer in Washington, D.C. 7 years ago. So she arrived in the call and she told me like, hey, I'm looking for a coach. Can I hire you to be my coach? And I said, well, tell me a little bit about what you're doing. And she told me that, most of her organization had left from her organization, and that she was the most senior member of the team that was left, right? And she had to do all of these things, fundraising and strategy and blah, blah. And I was like, okay, so before we talk about your plans, like, have you negotiated your new role? Have you negotiated your pay? Have you negotiated your responsibilities? She's like, no. And I asked, why not? Like, that's important. And and I coach her through how to have that conversation, Catherine. And then, the call ended. I left my life. We both continue our lives. And I saw her for the first time this week, and she reminded me of that conversation. And she reminded me about how I coach her through having a difficult conversation that gave her the confidence to, from then on, every year negotiate with her board, negotiate with organizations, where now she's executive director of a really large, important organization, and she coaches others to do the same. And I think that the truth is that for me, my job, and the reason it's important is because I work with people to help themselves see as the powerful people they are, as the powerful people who can change systems, as the powerful people who can change their lives, as the powerful people who can imagine different worlds. And at the end of the day, my job is to just instill the confidence, instill the skills, give them the coaching, and the clarity for them to do the best work they can do. And I think that's why it's important, because this work is isolating, and we get so many no's, and we go through so much failure, and the world seems bleak, and it seems like we're not making change and we're not making progress. And we can be working from that miasma. We have to work from a place of hope. We have to work from a place of light and lightness and joy. And I think that my job is to remind people that if hope is a discipline, I can help you practice it, right? And I can help you get clarity to it and making a plan for it as well.
Oh, I love that so much. There's just so much negativity in the work that we do, because so much of creating change in the world is about fixing problems. And so, naturally, there's a lot of focus on the problems, and the work itself is isolating and it's very difficult. And similarly to what you just articulated, I very much see my role as helping people really tap into the possibility and the positivity and the hope of what we do, because it's a much more powerful tool than negativity and diminishing. And the diminishment and the making our dreams smaller, we don't need to feed that. Like, the outside world feeds that for us. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is feed the hopeful inside of us and inside.
And by the way, Catherine, this is a flip question, but like, how do you do that? Because I was thinking when I was answering this question right now, it's like, how do we do that to others, but then how do we do it to ourselves? How do you do it yourself?
Yeah. So the way I think about it, are you familiar with the anecdote of the two wolves inside of ourselves? Are you familiar with this?
No.
Okay.
No.
So just in case you or anyone listening hasn't heard this before. So it's an old parable of a grandfather who is with his grandson, and he says to the grandson, grandson, there's two wolves inside of you at all times. And one wolf represents everything that's hard and negativity and things that are difficult and heavy and challenging. And the other wolf represents everything that is possible and positive and optimistic and hopeful. And these two wolves are fighting inside of you at all times. And the grandson says, well, which wolf is going to win? And the grandfather says, grandson, the one that will win is the one that you feed. Mm-hmm. And that is such a powerful, when I first heard that, it was such a powerful story for me, and I use it a lot in my work. And I think about feeding, I think about it in my head, I think about it as feeding the hope wolf. And what are all the ways that feed the hope wolf? And the pessimistic wolf, I don't need to feed that wolf. Like it's fed
that
by the
news finds media. Food always.
It finds food always. The news media, the headlines, my own exhaustion, like that one is very self-sustaining. Yeah. And so how can I feed the hope wolf? And building on top of what you were saying before is what that looks like changes. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the hope wolf is fed by my clients. A lot my clients. There is so much incredible work happening in our local communities. And the work happening on the local level doesn't match the very doomsday news headlines that you read. And so I try to not read news really. And if I do, I don't read headlines or I don't linger on them. And then I focus on the work that my clients are doing, connecting with other change makers like you. That's one way. Certainly connecting with my team and feeding off of what motivates them. And then sometimes it's about, if all else is lost and I'm feeling sort of depleted, Then I use what I call a bridging statement for myself, where I'm like, is it possible that everything is going to turn out okay? And sometimes, you feel like everything is not going to turn out okay, but it's always possible that it might. And so those are some of the things that I do. But it really, as with anything, that what you give your attention to grows.
Yeah.
And so I found now that over time, it kind of does it naturally on its own.
Yeah, that's a beautiful reflection. And I love that idea of like the wolf that survives is the one that you feed. That is just a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Well, and how are some ways that you feed kind of the hope wolf? How do you feed the hope wolf inside of yourself, Luis?
One thing, you're right. Is the negative one. I think it's and by the way, it's also the people that I surround myself of, right? Like, I sometimes I'm around people who are, very negative in their views, and I think that I absorb that too, right? So I try to stop it. I try to be like, is this relationship is the relationship adding, right? Because I can't be the one always kind of like feeding their wolves either, right? So I have to sometimes take some space from people who are pretty negative. I think the other thing that I feel is that, at the end of the day, hopelessness, I think it's really related to ego. What I mean by that is like, if we believe that everything is already bad and it will be bad forever, it is a truly individualistic way of thinking that only feeds our ego to know that we are in control of something, right? That we just know that things are going to be bad. That's a control I have. And I try to remind myself that by staying in that place, it is actually a place that decreases my consciousness, decreases my growth as a human. And I'm constantly thinking about that hope. It's a lot more work, right? So figuring out what's good about a situation, figuring out how do we fight or combat a situation. Now, the setbacks enrage me, right? Like here in Arizona, HCR 2060, this law that it's, basically empowering police officers to stop people based on their color of their skin. We fought that, 14 years ago, and I was part of the fight, and it just enrages me that we're going back to something like that. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, this is a different moment. This is a different time. Let's think about what that means. And that exercise of not stopping in despair is actually what helps us change society. Because again, none of us know the future. We are imagining it. And I think right now we're living a present that someone imagined before. And I think that is the thing. This is the key, is like those who are engaged, those who are paying attention, those who are actively imagining are the ones who will change society. And I feel like that it's a really, really important act of defiance. And I feel that's the way that I feed it, right? I meet people like you were talking about who inspire me. I meet organizers who are like going out there in 100 and something degrees to talk to other people. And that's what gives me hope, I think.
I really love that you shared that. And I think it raises such an important point, which is feeding the hope wolf and spending as much time as you can with the hope wolf is not about blindly closing your eyes and shoving your fingers in your ears and hoping that everything's going to be okay. Being, like you said, like being enraged, being offended, being disgusted at the status quo and what is happening is a part of the work. The key is not getting stuck there, as you said, and translating that into action and forward motion. Hey everyone, Catherine here. If you're listening to this podcast, you are likely seeking to create change. And the key to creating change is bringing your audiences into your story. At Javelina, we work with our clients to develop impactful marketing strategies driven by three vital things: who you're trying to reach, what you're trying to achieve, and the why behind it all. And our marketing strategies help our clients reach more people and drive more impact in their local community. So if you are looking to elevate your impact, head over to javelina.co today to sign up for a free consultation. Let's bring your story to life. So who do you see that is most impacted by your work? If there's an avatar or a beneficiary of your work that you picture in your mind, who is it?
I do feel, Catherine, that it comes to, social change makers, particularly those who are working with low income or communities of color in the United States. I think that that is not, by the way, a market, quote unquote, that I define as people that I will be working with. But I think it's like are people who have similar life experiences to mine, have similar efforts to what I've either led or been part of. And I think that, those life experiences have helped me kind of find that these communities are the ones that I can be most helpful with. So I work with a lot of executive directors, organizing directors, organizers, doing coaching, training, facilitation, so that they can do the things they want to do in the future. And ultimately, of course, right, like institutions and the preservation of institutions, uh, it's only a tactic for the goal of changing society, right? So I really truly believe that if I am equipping and if I am supporting the people who are making change out there, they will make it. So in some ways, I feel like I'm like the Formula One people in the pits, or or the doctor that you come and check sometimes, and tells you like, let's make a plan for your health. That's who I am, and my clients in some ways are the social change agents. And that's where I am now, right? A few years ago, I was the social change agent out there, right? And I might change again, right? So again, it's like
Right.
it's where I can be helpful, and right now in the place where I sit, with over 20 years of experience doing this type of work and the networks and relationships I have, I think this is where I can be helpful.
Yeah. And sometimes that one of the things that people struggle with this idea of having a clear sense of who it is that you serve and who you do the work for is that it's exclusionary. When we are talking to our clients and we ask who is most benefiting from your work, more often than not, the first answer they give us is everyone. We want everyone to benefit. And so has it been helpful for your work to have a more narrow, clear sense of who your perfect partner is?
Yeah, I always tell everybody that when they say everyone, that's no one, right? Like they have to be
Yes.
super specific because it requires everyone is no one. I always say, and it requires hard work to think about who. Or sometimes the answer of like community. I'm like, yeah, but which community, right? And that kind of like sharpening of the thinking, I think it is so often forgiven. Um, to leaders who are in positions of power, because that's another thing, right? Like these folks are in positions of power. The decisions they make, touch and affect communities and societies. So really sharpening on the answer of who those are, I think it's a really good question. So when they say community, I ask them things like which community? Well, everyone. Okay. When you say everyone, who do you imagine? Thinking about who you're seeing. Let's describe. Let's give them a name. And I start like asking those things. And for me, Catherine, like, well, I am, for example, saying that these social change agents are, in organizations. I'm learning right now, Catherine, that after the pandemic, there was a really big, influx of consultants into the industry because
Mm.
there were so many people who left their jobs. They started doing things on their own and, taking gigs and stuff like that. And I started realizing like the industry that I work in was like saturated with consultants, which is what I do and you do.
Right.
And I thought, interesting. So what do I do here? Like it's one person against a company, right? Like, of course, their prices are going to be cheaper. Sometimes their expertise is not, but like someone might go there for price, right? Or they have very specific experiences or expertises in work that requires a lot more, right, of different kinds of skill sets. So what I started thinking now, Catherine, is like, so instead of competing with folks, what if I help them be successful? So what I'm thinking about now is what are the services I can offer independent consultants to be more successful. So that's another community I'm starting to think about, right? Like, can I help them, do invoicing easier or contracts easier or things that they don't require a lot of skill from me because I've been doing it for so long and we have the tools, but that will help an individual contractor or consultant do a really good job with an organization that I would never work at. So that's the type of thinking that I think it's always evolving for me. It's like on the question of how do I be helpful, that moves me from competition to added value as well.
Well, and it's a fantastic example of how your definition of success and your why, how am I helpful, translates into a different set of actions.
Yeah.
That it would be very easy for you to keep your the knowledge and the expertise and the skills that you've built to yourself, and to think about yourself competing with people in your space. But because you are so hardwired and you know that your why is, how am I helpful, you're asking yourself that question, and it's creating a different set of actions and a different set of results.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's exciting. And also, sometimes I do things like this and they fail,
Right.
and that's fine.
Right. Yeah.
As well.
I mean, well, failure is a part of it, right? Like failure is just such an important part of it. That you and I, before we started recording, were talking about play and the power of play, not only for children, but adults. And one of the things that is central to the definition of play and the reading I've done is that you can't fail at play. Like if you're playing as a kid and you're building some sort of Lego structure and it falls, nobody's saying to you, well, that was a failure.
Yeah, that was
because
dumb.
that was stupid. There's no play doesn't have a goal, so therefore it's impossible to fail at it. So when I'm trying to do new things sometimes in my work, I try and use the language for myself. Like, I'm just playing. Yeah. I'm playing. I'm gonna I've been doing a lot more communications and social media in the last few years around my personal brand. And when I first started posting on LinkedIn 3 days a week and was just feeling very exposed and sharing my stories of my businesses and the change makers that I work with, and I told myself every day I had to post, I was like, I'm just playing. This is play. And if I fail, then it's fine, because there's no goal with play.
Yeah, there's such a freedom in that liminal space of like not having to do something for a reason, but also having a reason for it. It's like, it's such a powerful thing, and it lets you do things that I think sometimes, again, we stop ourselves from doing. And I'm so glad because even in personal brand, we are entering a time, not entering, we've been in that time for a while where like personal brands matter, right? And if those makes us uncomfortable, they impact our business, our ability to do business, right? Or our ability to make change. And I mean, it's so hard. So like approaching it as a way of, not as a compliance, I'm doing this because I have to, but I'm doing this because I'm trying it, is so liberating. So I'm so glad you shared that experience.
And so there's a couple of specific questions I want to ask you. So when you think about working with the change makers that you do and creating change in local community through community engagement and storytelling like you do, what are some of the things that people get wrong about that work?
One of the things that I think I am really reflecting on that people get wrong right now is that we define who the quote unquote opposition or the enemy is, and we are inflexible about it, right? Like we're like, it is a specific person, right? It's a specific group. It's a specific, background of people. And what I think that does in social change is that it doesn't recognize that because of the deep inequities that are in our society, the social construct that we've had, in the post-industrial society has changed, right? Like we have now people who live off the gig economy, and they don't have the benefits and things and access that they had before working on a company, and they're pretty much exposed. So they feel different about companies, right? They have different thoughts about how the economic system works. Young people looking at the future of a world that's hotter, that might not be, super nice to them, that they might not be able to buy a house. And like these kind of like, as the world is evolving, the way that our societies are perceiving of change is different. And I think too often we are stalking who is the enemy, and that lack of flexibility and like continuous analysis and forces us to work with whoever we're comfortable with. And I think that's what's happening right now in this tribalism of today, is that communities and organizations are working just with those who they're comfortable with, people who they're going to get snaps from, people who they're going to get yeses from, because it's hard to be in dissent. It's hard to work across difference. It's hard to work with someone who might say something that you're like, woo, I don't agree with that, but we agree on the same thing, right? Like, let's go do this thing together and peace, right? That's fine. See you later. That level of complexity or nuance is almost as if it's not gratifying. It's not, incentivized. And I think that's the biggest mistake I see over and over in social change right now, and change makers, is that we have presumed alliances that we're not revisiting. And under our nose, those presumed alliances are breaking. Under our nose, communities are leaving us. Under our nose, people are thinking of us as like people who are not in touch with society or what's happening in their communities because they are living it. And we still have a theory that is stuck, in 5-6 years ago. And I think that truth telling is important, but also, it's about it's about seeing the world differently and doing things that are really hard. And that's where our work comes, right? Like, how do we tell those stories? How do we help people see that, right? Etc.
One of the themes I'm really hearing in our conversation and seems central to your work, so tell me if I'm right, is that you hold flexibility at the center of your approach, that you don't get attached to a particular paradigm or way of doing something, or even a particular definition of success, that you always have to be open to being responsive in the moment and thinking, what makes sense now. Is that true?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Catherine, that I think that I one of my biggest inspirations of the work that I've been doing the last decade is Adrienne Marie Brown and her book Emergent Strategies. And the reason is because at the root of it, what it says is that we can learn so much from society. As societies, we can learn so much from nature. And what nature teaches us is that the organisms that live, that stay around, that don't disappear, are the ones that adapt, right? Are the ones that are constantly adapting, are constantly making alliances with new, organisms. And she talks about the fungi, right? Like the fungi system, right? How those organisms, including trees and plants that partner with fungi, always thrive and succeed because there's a function of the fungi who helps them thrive, right? But the trees are constantly changing and thinking and sending signals to each other, and sometimes one of them dies and the other ones thrive, and I think we can learn from that. And I know that sounds all kind of like a little too nebulous and crazy, but I feel like that's how I think about us. I think about like we are constantly changing. We have to be asking ourselves if we're flexible enough to meet those moments. For example, people hire me often to create strategic plans, right? And what I tell them often is, you want to create a 10-year plan? Okay, let's do it. But in year one, that plan is going to change. So what I rather do is think of a North Star, something you want to see true in the world, right? Imagining that future you want, but then actually creating the systems to check from time to time if your strategies are actually getting you there. So I rather strengthen your ability to think and be flexible than being this rigid thing that organizations sometimes create. And then people come to them and they're like, hey, we want to be free. Can you help us be free? And they're like, that's not in my plan. Or I don't have a grant for that. Going back to Harriet Tubman, imagine if she had to request for a grant to make people free. She would have never done it. So This is the thing about is we have to think about in a little bit more flexible way. And I think nature can tell us so much. And that book and that thinker, Adrienne Marie Brown, has been instrumental for me.
That's wonderful. I'll definitely have to check that out, which leads us really nicely into my last set of questions. So for those that are listening who want to learn more about your approach to your work, what is one resource that you would suggest to them? A book, podcast, a website where they can really learn more and dig deeper?
Well, one thing is it's Emergent Strategies from Adrienne Marie Brown. I really like the book, and I'm looking this way because I actually always have it there as a way to like grab it. I'm gonna tell you, I first time I read the book, I thought like I don't think I get it, but every time I come back to it, I get a new thing. And then at the end of the book, in the back part, there are tools that tells you how to facilitate, how to set up a meeting, how to have difficult conversations, stuff like that. I really like her thinking, and it's really rooted in Black feminism, but it's also really rooted in a history of people who have been challenging us to think, how do we learn from nature, right? Like she talks about fractals, for example, like these repetitions that exist in nature that have a purpose, right? And her question is like, what are the things that we repeat over and over again for a purpose in our communities? There are things like that and questions that I think really deep and help us kind of like make sense of the world at a time where like things don't make sense. Frameworks to make sense of the world are really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And then what is something that, a question or a prompt that listeners can maybe think differently about social change work based on your point of view?
Catherine, I'm sorry that is not one, but I always say that I have three questions in my back pocket. I always share that with people. And I've been using these three questions for every time I feel like, am I still the right way? Am I going the right way? And the first one is actually the one that we've been talking about, like how do I add value? How am I helpful? And the way that I answer that is like, if someone else is better positioned to do it, they should do it. If I can help them, even better. If I am uniquely positioned to do this, I'm gonna feel it and know it in my instinct. And I think that too often, Catherine, we play a careers game of like, what's the title or position or thing that is gonna take me to the next thing? And then that puts us in a place of competition again. And I rather think about my value, the value I'm adding, because that's gonna break through, right? The thing. So that's the first question. The second one is, what is something that I'm really afraid of falling flat on my face, but that I have to master, right? And I always have something like that. Sometimes it's as simple as like, I want to stop shaking my leg because I'm too nervous. Right now is that I really want to be less impatient and be okay when I don't have anything else to do. I was sharing this with you, right? Like, if I'm done with something, I don't have to feel impatient that I have to be in the next thing already. How do I am I present, right? That's the question I'm asking myself right now. But that's hard, and that's hard at work. That's hard in conversations. That's hard in meetings, right? So I'm that's the thing that I'm learning. But also, if the next experience that I have professional is going to make me exercise that, that's the best place for me to be, because I'm going to grow, I'm going to be challenged, etc. And the last piece is then, what is it that I want in my life? What I think about is like, how much do I want to make? Where do I want to live? What's the type of people I want to work? I think most of us start with that last question when we're thinking about our lives and our purpose in life, instead of the first two. And if you answer the first two, the third one is going to be easier, because the third one is just negotiation. So that's, for me, the way that I think about social change is like, people should be constantly checking, am I adding value? Am I learning something? And does this align with what I want with my life right now? Therefore, I'm in a good place. Or no, it's time to move. Or it's time for me to change my conditions to stay here for longer and be more impactful.
Yeah. And what is one thing that people listening can do, one action that they can take to drive more change in their local community?
Catherine, I have a couple of friends who do not work in politics, and every single election year, they, how would I say this? Give me speeches and advice, and send me articles about what we should be doing in our world or in our work, and why is it that this is working and not working, and why Biden should say this or Trump should not. And at the end of the day, what I always tell them is, the most important thing that you can do is that you have 3 or 4 friends, by the way, that I know, that are in the wrong side of history, that are against me living in this country, that are against my brother loving who they love, that are against my sister having the rights that she has. And rather than you trying to give advice to someone who's a political worker, try to have a conversation with those friends that you have. Just invite them for a drink, have dinner with them, talk about it. Because I think, Catherine, we're giving too much power to the untouchable, the organizations, the politicians, but we are all political. We all are political beings. The moment that we wake up, the moment we go to bed, and even when we were sleeping, we're political beings, because of the decisions that we make, the things we purchase, the things we say, the things we are. So what I would tell people is, start with conversations. Talk across difference with people who you think you might not agree with something, not to argue or convince them, and to hear them out. Because most of the disagreement that exists right now is just that we are in our own camps and we're not coming to each other and just listen. And I bet that after those conversations, your perspective about social change is going to change, because it's not about a wand or a speech or a narrative. It's about relationships and conversations. And none of us are leaning into that because we're way too comfortable hanging out with the ones that we know agree with us.
That agree with us. I love that. I could not agree more. I think that it is such an incredible way for us to make change that we completely overlook. So I'm glad that you brought us back there. Luis, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, for sharing all of your wisdom with us, but most importantly for the work that you do, because it's truly changing the world, and I'm honored to know you.
Thank you. And thank you, because you're always willing to partner. You're always willing to share, your expertise, your knowledge, and you're just such a joy. Thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thanks, Luis. You're the best. I absolutely loved Luis's approach to his work, his passion for what he does. And so much of what he does overlaps with our core philosophy about how you make change at Javelina, which is you need to know why you do the work, You need to know who the work is for, the target audiences that you need to engage in your work, and you need to know how success is defined. And as we were talking about the social change work that he does, again and again and again, Luis came back to 1, 2, 3 of those things. And it really just goes to show that that approach really is how you drive effective change. Luis's work, without a doubt, is creating change around our world. And it's such an honor to know him. And I was really excited to be able to share this with you. As ever, if you enjoyed this podcast, please like it, share it, be able to leave us a review. That would be really helpful. We, having relaunched How to Change the World, when you do that, when you engage with the podcast, when you share it with others, when you leave a like, when you leave a review, when you follow us on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, it helps us grow and it helps us reach more people. So if you can do that for me, I will be perpetually grateful. And until next time, when I cannot wait to share another story of change with you, have a great one.